Recently, a friend of mine from Brazil and I were discussing history together when he threw a curveball question at me that, while the idea of it being asked is certainly fathomable, it was nevertheless a question that I've hitherto asked myself. The question that he asked had to do with the general direction in which history is taking us. In other words, is it possible to know where yesterday's past will lead to before we enter tomorrow? Now, as someone who is always focused on the depths and not the widths of history, that is to say, the specifics and not the fundamentals or the niche and not the general, I seldom ponder upon such big picture questions and then at that look at history from a bird's eye view in order to see if there are any patterns that could take us, humanity, to a place unknown or all too familiar. I believe it is quite the mark of an educated and competent historian to be able to build some kind of historical profile based on past events and use that to predict with some degree of accuracy just where we're going. I unfortunately do not fit amongst such distinguished hypotheticals as historians. Yet, at the same time, I did, however, come with a rather quick answer, and that was, if I may say so, quite nifty and clever given the quick thinking that was required to answer the question since it truly did come from nowhere. Always one to be able to think on the spot. The first thing that I noticed in being where history is taking us was the fact that it almost sounds as if history is just this giant behemoth of sorts, a force of such magnitude that is to be reckoned with. It sounds as if history is this magnificent tide of astronomical proportions that can sweep this tiny speck of dust called humanity in unimaginable directions. And while this might not be far from the truth, it must be remembered that this giant force that we call history is still something that was caused by humanity in the first place. I put out to my friend that just as history impacts humanity, we at the same time do much to impact history itself. Maybe not directly, but the situations that made history were still made by other situations. And behind these situations was humanity itself, who in turn was shaped by history. In other words, just as history creates humanity as it is today, this humanity in turn creates history. But here's the catch. The degree to which humanity is influenced by history depends on the degree to which history was influenced by humanity in the first place, and of course, vice versa. To explain this to my friend, I use the analogy of a man jumping on a trampoline. We know that the higher the man jumps, the deeper into the trampoline he will sink down to. The reason why the man was able to jump up as high as he did in the first place was that he had sunk so low prior to the rise. What caused him to sink was that he jumped, but the jump itself would only have existed had he sunk in the first place, and thus one cannot have one without the other. But if one were indeed happen, we would surely see an equal and opposite reaction. History, too, is no different. One cannot create history if he were to have not been created in the first place, and wouldn't all that led to his creation fall into a category called history? And history cannot influence humanity and its direction had it not been for humanity itself. What follows, then, is that history creates what creates history, and humanity creates what creates humanity. It is a self-perpetuating cycle in which one becomes both the cause and the effect without having a chance to become neither either or neither. Thus, it is then tempting and perhaps true to see ourselves as forever trapped in a continuum, an endless cycle set and repeat. For we can only create history in the way that history has created us. If evolutionary history had led humanity to fly, then we flies would create history on that. If we were to be no flies but swimmers, then we would create history in that regard. And thus humanity would not have led humanity to create history as flyers. So, we can only create history to the degree to which we have been created. And history can only shape humanity to the degree to which history itself has been shaped. Just as the apple seed can revel in its power to create another apple, its history has made it so that it cannot create, it can create nothing but another of its kind. And what is scarier is that not only did history dictate what that seed would turn into, but also the fact that it does not, or lacks the capabilities to become something else. Actually, this might sound more obvious than scary, but think about it. If one wants to change history, was it not history itself that made the person have the desire to change it? Was it not the history of certain values being instilled in that person? And was it not the history of certain events that came into existence that led to this person to want to change history? If a person gets up on his homework after 10 hours of trying, was it not the first historical 9 hours that led to this moment? If a revolution is successfully carried out, Was it not the history of evolution in general, among other things, that led to it? Every event, but also every desire to change the event, as well as every concern, every feeling attached to it, was it all not the result of history? And is it not precisely these events, desires, concerns, and attached feelings that in turn makes the history? It is generally agreed upon that few things, if even that, were inevitable events. Nothing in history is inevitable, they say, yet at the same time, given that history was caused by history itself, it is then not inevitable in the sense that whatever moment it culminated in was the result of that which led to the culmination in the first place. In this sense, does fate exist? Does destiny exist in the sense that one becomes the result of all things prior? Was it meant to be that you see these very words because of certain events that made you equipped with necessary skills to read, and also certain events that made you patient to listen until the very end? Does history and make humanity that in turn make history not recreate itself, and humanity and making history that in turn makes humanity not recreate itself as well? If so, then who, or rather what, exactly listened to this article, and who or what wrote it?